Hello everybody, it is Tom, and welcome to another video. So, you may notice that my background is a little bit different, and that is because I have turned my desk so it faces the wall, which means my bookshelf is next to my desk. So for right now, we are not having a bookshelf in the back of the shot, but I'm hoping that you will survive and thrive even so. And I always tuck these guys into my shirt because if they dangle free, Darla will attempt to eat them. Anyway, so we are here to dive back in to Heartstopper, Comics versus Show. And that is, of course, where we look at the Heartstopper comics, and we look at the Heartstopper show, and we compare them. Last time, long ago, we looked at episode 2 of season 2 of Heartstopper, the show. And so today we're going to look at episode 3 of season 2 of Heartstopper, the show. This episode has a lot in it that is not represented in the comics. There are still some scenes that we can talk about and compare, but this episode, of all the episodes this season, probably has the least in common with the comics. Well, maybe, I guess episode 8 also has a lot that doesn't match up, but in any case, strangely enough, this is probably my favorite episode of the season, which is a surprise to me as well, because I love, and honestly, like, when I say my favorite, like, they're all at this level, and this episode might be, like, a fraction of an inch higher. Episode 8 is also, like, competing for the top episode, but pretty much anytime I watch any episode in this season, I'm like, this is my favorite. I think one of the reasons why I love this episode so much is because it delves so deeply into Nick's psychology and what is going on with him mentally. And I just love that. Like, I loved it so much I had to write a fan fiction about it, which you can read if you're a member of the Patreon. So what we're going to do is first, we're going to talk about what happens in the show, in the episode of the show. And then we're going to look at the parallel scenes from the comics and just talk in general about those two things. So, sound good? Yes? Maybe? You can't answer me because this is a video on YouTube? Well, you can answer me, I just can't hear you. Because I am in the past, and you are in the future, and I'm in a weird mood today, apparently. So let's talk about what happens in this episode of the show. Isaac and Charlie help Tao brainstorm date ideas for his date with Elle, and Tao suggests taking Elle to a restaurant, and then dares to suggest that a beach date is basic.
I mean, we went to the beach.
Oh, basic.
Rude!
Nick is stuck collecting cones after rugby practice with Christian, Cy, and Otis, who finally apologize for not sticking up for him or Charlie at the movies.
Sorry about what happened at the cinema. We should have spoken up.
Nick forgives them, Christian puts his foot in it by saying Nick and Charlie are really good mates, and Nick is too jarred by the ensuing romantic montage to even consider coming out to his friends in that moment.
Still couldn't come out to any of them.
Nick and Charlie have some playful banter in the equipment room about getting caught making out at school, and are, of course, immediately caught making out by Ms. Singh. Ms. Singh calls Nick into her office to offer her support and share the news that she has a wife, which is somehow a surprise despite the very obvious picture on full display on her desk, and then we move straight into Charlie putting off finishing his essay in favor of helping Nick study for his exam. Nick does great on the exam, Charlie manages to write his entire essay in a ridiculously short period of time, and the internet makes Tao question if maybe the key to romantic success is as simple as doing what his mom and the fandom have been asking him to do for ages, namely cutting his hair. At the Paris trip meeting, Nick tells Charlie he's going to come out to the rugby lads at the bonfire party. Tao shows up looking like he just had a life-changing week on Queer Eye and asks Elle out, and everything seems to be going great. Everything quickly goes to hell after that, however, as Nick ends up going into a panic attack at the bonfire and making himself sick with the stress of trying to come out to his friends, and Tao and Elle's date crashes and burns because Elle thinks Tao is acting like a completely different person, while Tao is hurt and jealous that Elle invited her friends to the party. After epically telling Harry to piss off, Charlie takes Nick home, and they have a beautiful talk about how Nick should wait to come out until he's really ready. Charlie's a bit sad since he wants everyone to know Nick is his boyfriend, but he's also determined to do what's best for Nick. And roll credits. This episode starts off with us hitting a huge high. It just gets so hopeful and has such a high note, and then things just crash and burn. And I'm usually not a fan of episodes where things crash and burn, but again, the psychology of Nick in this is just so interesting, and I love everything that they do about that. But we're not here just to talk about the show. So let's look at some of the scenes from the comics and how they relate to the scene of the show. So in the show, we have the rugby lads approaching Nick at practice, whereas in the comics, it's actually outside school. So school is over, and Nick is walking along, tapping a message out to Charlie. And then Christian, Cy, and Otis call his name. He turns around, and he's immediately like, unfriendly mode. I have nothing to say to you. And Cy says, we know, mate, and you don't have to. Can you just hear us out? And Nick is torn, but he finally turns around and says, fine, what? And Christian says, we're sorry. We should have stopped it and told Harry to fuck off. Otis says, not even just at the cinema. We should have done it ages ago. And Cy says, and I know we should have been better when Harry was picking on Charlie, but we can promise we'll be better friends from now on. Seriously. And Nick's just kind of getting more and more like, oh. Christian says, and we really like Charlie. He's a nice guy, and I don't want him to think we're like Harry. And Otis says, we're on your side, Nick. We're your friends if you still want us to be. Nick has a moment of thinking back on all the good times he shared with these guys, and he says, thanks for saying that. I know you're not like Harry, and I'm glad you finally want to ditch him. Apology accepted? And then they all come in, and it's good times. Hooray, hooray. And then Cy asks, has Harry been pestering either of you since that weekend? And Nick says, no, not really. We haven't seen him because of exams and study leave, to be honest. And Christian says, I seriously don't blame you for punching him. I know you and Charlie are really good mates. As he says that, you can see the sweat drop on Cy's face and on Otis's face, and they're both kind of staring at him like, dude. And then we have echoing in Nick's mind, really good mates, really good mates, really good mates, over a montage of him kissing Charlie. And Nick's like, yeah. Anyway, I've got to catch my bus. See you guys at rugby. And we have the ... from Christian, Cy, and Otis. Otis looking particularly annoyed. Otis says, why did you have to say good mates? He might have told us. And Christian says, what was I supposed to say? Hi, Nick, we know you and Charlie are a thing and that's fine. And Cy says, definitely not that. So that's how things go in the comics. So in the show, it is pretty similar. As we said, in this scene, it's rugby practice, and conveniently, the rugby guys and Nick and Charlie are all tasked at cleanup duty, which I think I mentioned this in the reaction to the show, but I do wonder if Ms. Singh had something in mind here of being like, I see that there's tension between you, Nick, and the people who used to be your best friends, so I'm going to put you all together and see what happens. So Nick is kind of gazing over at Charlie. Otis, Cy, and Christian kind of carefully approach Nick, and Otis, kind of making an overture of friendship, invites Nick to the end of GCSE party.
Do you hear we're having an end of GCSE party in the woods next week?
And not just Nick, but he says you guys should come.
Gonna be wild. And you guys should come.
He includes Charlie in that, which I think is a good way to get in there because, you know, obviously Harry having a problem with Charlie and Charlie being gay was the whole source of the conflict initially, so it's good that it makes a point of inviting Charlie. But Nick is still, like, kind of cold.
Yeah, cool, maybe.
And then we have further explanation of Otis telling him that they're not friends with Harry anymore.
Nick, man, we're not friends with Harry, them not anymore.
And poor Christian in the subtitles is just boy.
Yeah, we're sorry about what happened at the cinema. We should have spoken up.
So we have similar dialogue here of them apologizing, and Nick comes around pretty quickly.
Thanks. I do know you're not like Harry.
So in the comics, they do a little bit more explaining. But here, you know, it goes pretty quickly. It's pretty obvious that Nick wasn't enjoying being at odds with them. Like, shutting Harry out of his life, clearly he has lost no sleep over that. But these guys, like, I think he knows that they're good guys, but he just couldn't get over how they acted until they stepped up and apologized. So, very glad that they did.
Guess it took me a while to realize what a dick he is as well.
So then Nick kind of realizes, like, oh, well, you know, I kind of did the same thing where I saw all the bad things that Harry was doing pre-Charlie and never stood up to him. So for this reason, he can kind of better understand where the guys are coming from and take that step to accept their apologies. And here we have Christian, aka Boy, saying,
I seriously don't blame you for fighting him. I know you and Charlie are really good mates.
again, we have great reaction from Sai and Otis, and Nick just kind of like stunned by that. And Nick, who honestly, like, even if Christian had not said this, I don't think this was the moment when Nick would have come out to them. But it certainly didn't help that he said that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sai and Otis are immediately like, what'd you say that for? So in the comics, we get explicit confirmation that Sai, Christian, and Otis know that Nick and Charlie are going out, and that they've known for a while and are just trying to give him the time and the space to tell them. But here, it's left a little more obscure, but we still pretty much know that they know based on their reaction. This leads us into the scene where Nick and Charlie are in the equipment room. Nick is kind of lamenting the fact that he still wasn't able to come out to the rugby lads. And Charlie has to reassure him and be like, it's fine, there's no deadline. So, in the comics, it's actually a week later. It's just Nick and Charlie cleaning up after rugby practice, and Nick saying, I still couldn't come out to them. And Charlie says, Nick, it's fine, there's no deadline. And Nick says, I know, but it's annoying when people think we're just, and Charlie says, best platonic bros. And Nick says, oh my god. Now, this is the part where Charlie says, as they go into the equipment room, Charlie says, I'm not sure I could handle us being fully out right now anyway. And Nick says, huh? Why? And Charlie says, well, I've sort of been stressed out because of exams and being fully out as a couple, everyone talking about us. I think that would finish me off, haha. And Nick is very startled and says, hey, when did you start feeling like that? And Charlie says, it doesn't matter, it's just exam stress. I'm not saying you shouldn't come out, just forget I said anything. And Nick takes his arm and says, Charlie, and then kisses him, and they kiss and they kiss and they kiss, and Nick says, you can talk to me about it? And Charlie says, can you just kiss me again? And we're just passionately kissing, and Nick says, I can always do that. And that's when Ms. Singh walks in, saying, how bloody long does it take you boys to put away the... NANI? So, looking at this scene, in the show, it has a much more playful tone, because Charlie never outright states the fact that he is stressed about Nick coming out. It's something that Nick figures out himself as things go along, and finally talks to Charlie about while they're in Paris. We start off similarly, where Nick is like, I still couldn't tell them.
Still couldn't come out to any of them.
I think it does make a lot of sense to have these two scenes happen back to back instead of with the 1 week gap. I guess in the comics we can kind of assume that maybe he's just tried again to come out to them, it didn't happen. You know, I think it makes a lot of sense to have it go like it goes in the show, where we see him have the opportunity to tell them, he doesn't, and then we go directly into him and Charlie alone in the equipment room.
Like, it's fine, there's no deadline.
I know, but it's just annoying when people think we're, like...
Best bros.
I love the little, like, bro punch that Charlie gives Nick's arm.
I'm gonna tell some of the rugby guys at least. After exams, if I don't come out of school soon, we're probably gonna get found out anyway.
Interesting that you should say that, Nicholas.
NANI?
Because you keep wanting to kiss at school.
I think you're also to blame for that.
Don't know what you mean. I have never initiated a kiss at school.
Oh, really?
So I love that we have this playful little argument between the two of them. And I like also in the show that the focus is kept on Nick and on his difficulties coming out, because that's really the theme of this whole episode with the Nick and Charlie storyline, is that Nick is having trouble coming out to people. I like that we're keeping our focus on Nick here. I always enjoy when they're joking with each other and playing around with each other, and we see what good friends they are, aside from also being great boyfriends. So they have this playful argument about who initiates kisses, and the truth is they both do.
What about the changing room?
That didn't count.
Or the English room?
You kissed me first.
Or what about the...
Fine. You win.
And then we go into kissing, kissing, kissing.
Boys, I need...
And Ms. Singh walks in. Oh dear. So Ms. Singh in the comics we have her looking kind of exasperated and saying, just hurry it up, okay? I need to lock up soon. And Nick and Charlie both look very embarrassed, and Nick's like, yes, miss. And then after she leaves, they look at each other and start laughing and say, that was bound to happen at some point, which, yes, it was. You're just lucky it was Ms. Singh. So then they're walking along down the hallway, and Ms. Singh says, Nick, can I see you in my office, please? And Nick and Charlie both look very confused. Like, what could she possibly have to talk to Nick about? And as it turns out, in this case, she wants to tell Nick that he is going to be the captain of the rugby team starting in September. And there's sirens going on outside quite loudly, so just ignore that. Now, of course, in the show, he's already the captain of the rugby team. He's been the captain of the rugby team, so they couldn't use this as the reason. And I think it makes perfect sense that, like, she catches them making out in the equipment room and then calls Nick into her office to talk. And I think it's really interesting that she doesn't call Nick and Charlie. I think part of the reason for this is that Charlie is the out gay kid. He's solid in his identity. But this is the first that Ms. Singh knows of Nick's sexuality that we know of. I mean, him and Charlie are not subtle, so she could have figured it out before now. But regardless, I think she sees this as the opportunity to kind of be what Mr. Ajayi is to Charlie to Nick. So she's kind of the queer teacher reaching out to the queer student who is clearly at the beginning of his journey and potentially will run into some roadblocks there. As an athlete herself, I think she sees a lot of herself in Nick and her own journey and knows that it's a difficult road when you're in sports as a queer person. So, I think it makes sense that she wants to talk to Nick one-on-one and give him a space where he's able to speak freely, completely freely, even without Charlie there. And this got really long, so we're gonna stop here for now, and part 2 will be out next Friday, so look forward to that, I guess. Yay! Huge thanks as always to our patrons, who are amazing and awesome and wonderful and fantastic, and a special shout out to our Nick Nelson members, Kelly Walker, Paul Z, Kent Smither, Kim Engel, and Lauren Javier. Alright, see you guys next week. Goodbye!